Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Part 21, Information as Constraint. Remember the language we are learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase, one continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once. Time as omega, space as k, and motion as v, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we listen to just one of those echoes. We now stand at the summit of Ep.8, the pure abstract language. We have built a complete linguistic organism, from the circular nature of phi, through its derivatives and dimensional projections, through grammar, topology, semantics, intensity, action, and spectral modes. Until now, we have focused mainly on how phi speaks, which symbols it uses, which rules it follows, which structures it can form. From this point onward, we begin to ask a slightly different question. Not only how does phi speak, but also what does its speech do? What does it contain? How does it narrow possibilities and build specific worlds? Today, we step into Book 8.6, Abstract Information, Patterns, Possibilities, and Computation. And we begin with the most fundamental idea in this book, information as constraint. Part 1, the game of questions and possibilities. Imagine you are playing a game of 20 questions with a friend. Your friend chooses something in their mind. It could be anything: a cat, the Eiffel Tower, the number 7, a childhood memory, a galaxy cluster, a poem. At the beginning of the game, the space of possibilities is huge. You know almost nothing. Then you ask your first question: is it alive? If the answer is yes, you have ruled out all non-living things. If the answer is no, you have ruled out all living things. Either way, that single answer has narrowed the space of what it could be. That narrowing is information. You keep going. Is it something you can hold in your hand? Is it bigger than a house? Is it something you can see? Each answer restricts the possibilities further. You are not adding something to the hidden object. You are cutting away the space of things it could have been. Eventually, if your questions are chosen well, you reach a point where only one possibility is left. The game ends. You say, it's the moon, or it's a piano, or it's your grandmother. The entire conversation was a series of constraints. Each answer said, not this, not that either. The final guess is simply what survived all the cuts. In this sense, information is deeply simple. It is the reduction of possibility. It is the ruling out of alternatives. It is the shift from, it could be almost anything, to, it must be this specific thing. It is not a substance or a fluid. It is the narrowing of a possibility space. Now transfer this intuition into the phi language. The pure, abstract space of possibilities is the space of all mathematically allowed configurations of phi. All the ways the field could be arranged on its circle, all the ways its derivatives could unfold in time, space, and motion. That space is vast. When a particular configuration of phi actually exists, with specific values, specific gradients, specific topological structures, that configuration has ruled out almost all of the others. It is as if reality has answered a huge number of yes or no questions all at once. The actual world is one very special narrowing inside an ocean of possibilities. That narrowing is what we are calling information. Part 2. The story that could have been different. In our language metaphor, information is the meaningful difference between the story that is actually told and all the stories that could have been told but never were. Think of a writer facing a blank page. At that moment, almost anything is possible. The main character could be a child, a soldier, a scientist, a river, a star. The world could be realistic, magical, futuristic, or ancient. Every word the writer starts to type is a constraint. The first sentence, "It was a dark and stormy night," has already ruled out "it was a bright and silent noon." The writer has committed to a mood, a time, a feeling. With each paragraph, more possibilities fall away. By the end of the book, the story is one specific path through the space of all possible stories. The information in the novel lives in this specificity, in the fact that things could have gone differently but did not. The same idea holds for phi. Before a specific pattern of phi is chosen, the field could be many different smooth functions on its domain. It could hold many different arrangements of derivatives, curvatures, and topological features. Once the field is in a particular configuration, once it expresses a particular pattern, it has committed. It has chosen one novel out of the infinite library of novels that could have been written in the phi language. The plot is the arrangement of patterns. The constraints are the choices that exclude all other arrangements. It is these constraints that carry information. It is important here to make a subtle but crucial distinction. There are two ways people sometimes talk about information. One is randomness as information. A string of random digits is hard to compress and therefore has high Shannon information. The other is structure as information. A highly ordered, meaningful pattern that stands out from pure noise. In the Holophase perspective, we are interested primarily in the second type, information as structured constraint. A completely random field that could just as well have been something else at every point may be high entropy, but it is not deeply structured. A highly organized, law-saturated structure, like a coherent wave, a crystalline lattice, or a carefully encoded message, is rich in constraint. It rules out almost all other possibilities in a precise way. That is the kind of information we are focusing on here. Part 3. The scientific essence, specificity of patterns. What, in more formal terms, does information as constraint ask about phi? It asks, how much have you narrowed down the space of what you could have been? Imagine all possible patterns phi could explore. Now imagine the actual pattern we are observing. The more special, structured, and law-bound this pattern is, the more other patterns it excludes, and the more information it contains in our sense. We can feel this through our three echoes. First, the time echo. Consider a rhythm, a completely irregular, jittery signal that changes unpredictably from moment to moment does not give you much to hold on to. It is hard to compress, but it is also hard to identify any simple law behind it. Now consider a pure, steady oscillation with a precise period. That rhythmic pattern is highly constrained. Its phase and frequency are tightly specified. It rules out almost all other possible time behaviors. That extra specificity is what we call information in the time projection. Second, the space echo. Think of a perfectly uniform field in space. Phi has the same value everywhere. That is actually a very special pattern, but once you know its single value, there is no further detail to specify. The structure is simple. Now compare that with a sharply varying pattern, like a crystal with a precise repeating lattice, or a localized bump with a sharply defined edge. Those spatial arrangements have more internal specificity, particular gradients, curvatures, and symmetries that must hold. They rule out many other spatial patterns that would break these features. That surplus of could have been otherwise but isn't is spatial information. Third, the motion echo. Think of a localized wave packet moving coherently at a fixed velocity, maintaining its shape over time. Its trajectory in spacetime is highly constrained. It follows one specific path instead of wandering randomly. It keeps its internal structure instead of dispersing into noise. This persistence of identity, this self-consistency of motion, is a strong constraint. It singles out a very small set of allowed histories from a vast space of possible histories. that is motional information. In all three echoes, the same idea appears. Information is not a thing added to phi. It is a way of describing how tightly phi's actual pattern sits inside the space of its possible patterns. The more structured and law-bound the pattern, the more it stands out against the background of what else could have happened. That standing out is information. Part 4. The master tree and the specific leaf. Now place information in the master tree of derivatives. The tree itself represents the full derivative hierarchy of phi: trunk, branches, twigs, and leaves. At any given height in the tree, you can imagine many possible shapes the branches could have taken. A particular path of branching, with splits at specific heights, with particular angles and patterns, represents a specific choice among many possible ways the tree could have grown. Information is like the uniqueness of each leaf. Take two leaves on the same branch. Both are leaves, both obey the general leaf grammar of that species, but one might be nearly symmetrical and plain, while the other is finely serrated, veined, and asymmetrical. The second leaf is more specific. Its shape requires more detailed description. It rules out more alternative shapes that do not have those intricate details. That extra specificity is what we call higher information. In this picture, the entire tree is a monument of information. Each split in the branch structure, each bend, each cluster of leaves is a choice among alternatives. The exact pattern of branching is a heavy constraint on the space of possible trees. The master tree of phi is similar. Each higher derivative, each topological feature, each mode amplitude is a choice. The full pattern of those choices is the informational content of that configuration. Part 5. Information and its neighbors. Meaning, intensity, action, modes. Information as constraint is not a new layer sitting above everything else. It is woven through all the structures we have already built. It is tightly bound to meaning. Earlier, we said that meaning arises from relations between symbols inside the language. The way omega relates to phi, the way k relates to curvature, the way constraints tie derivatives together. Information comes in when we ask how far those relations and constraints narrow the space of allowed states. The richer and more interconnected the relational structure, the more specific the allowed configurations become. In that sense, meaning is about what depends on what, and information is about how narrowly those dependencies define what is possible. Information also interacts with intensity. Quadratic forms like omega squared or the magnitude of k squared tell us how strong the change is. When a signal has a very low intensity compared to its noise background, it is hard to distinguish from random fluctuation. In practice, it carries little usable information because it does not reliably rule out alternative interpretations. When the intensity is large and coherent, the signal stands out clearly. It more decisively rules out alternative explanations. In that sense, higher intensity, when structured, often means more robust information. But intensity alone is not information. A loud noise that is completely random does not carry much structured constraint. Intensity and structure together matter. Action 2 speaks the language of information. We described action as an optimality principle. Among all possible stories consistent with boundary conditions, the system tends to follow the one that extremizes the action. One way to read this in informational terms is that the actual history of phi is the one that achieves a very particular balance of constraints. Boundary conditions fix some aspects. The action functional chooses, from the huge space of internally allowed paths, one or a very small family of them. The path is not random, it is tightly constrained. In a deep sense, the dynamic laws of phi are a way of selecting highly specific, law-saturated, information-rich histories. Finally, spectral modes give us a natural coordinate system for measuring informational constraint. Once we decompose a pattern of phi into its modes, each mode amplitude becomes a degree of freedom. If only a few mode amplitudes are non-zero and all others are exactly zero, that is an extremely strong constraint. The pattern lives in a tiny subspace of all possible combinations. If many modes are active with precise, correlated amplitudes, that is also a strong constraint. Information can be seen as the degree of narrowing in mode space. Which modes are allowed, how tightly their amplitudes and phases are fixed, and how many patterns are excluded by that choice. Part 6. The work of information. Distinction, memory, communication. What work does information do in the abstract? It enables distinction. Without constraints, everything would be equally possible, and nothing would stand out. Every configuration of phi would blend into every other. There would be no this and that, no before and after, no objects, no events, no identities. Constraint breaks this sameness. It carves the sea of possibilities into distinct islands. Those islands are recognizable states. Information is the shape of those islands. Once states are distinct, information also enables memory. A memory is a configuration that is stable enough, constrained enough, that it persists and can later be recognized. A crystal remembers its lattice structure. A waveguide remembers its allowed modes. A written word remembers a thought. Each of these is a very special constraint imposed on phi, or on more ordinary physical fields in the interpreted version. Information is what makes these patterns stick in a recognizable way. With distinct, memorable patterns, communication becomes possible. A sender can choose one pattern from a set of allowed patterns to represent a message. A receiver can observe the pattern and infer which alternatives have been ruled out. That is communication, the transfer of constraints from one region of the field to another, or from one system to another. The abstract phi language, once it has information, now has the capacity to talk to itself across time and space. Part 7. Informational universality and its limits. The Holophase framework makes a bold claim. Any physical notion of information that really matters operationally should be expressible as a measure of constraint on possible configurations of some phi-like structure. Whether we are looking at thermodynamic entropy, quantum entanglement, genetic coding, or digital data, the core idea should be the same. Information tells us how tightly the actual state sits inside the space of possible states. Take thermodynamic entropy. A gas in a box can be arranged in countless ways at the molecular level. If all we know is its macroscopic properties, total energy, volume, number of particles, then many microstates are possible. High entropy means that the actual microstate is not strongly constrained by our knowledge. Low entropy means the microstate is very special. Many alternatives have been ruled out. In our language, more detailed constraints on phi means more information and less entropy. Entropy measures missing information. Information measures applied constraint. Quantum information works similarly, but with subtler structure. Entanglement between two regions of a system implies that their joint state is more constrained than the states of the parts taken separately. Correlations rule out combinations that would have been possible if the parts were independent. The entanglement entropy quantifies how much non-local constraint is shared between the regions. Again, information shows up as constraint in the joint possibility space. In biology, the sequence of nucleotides in DNA is a rich, structured constraint on biochemical possibilities. That sequence selects one particular class of proteins and developmental pathways from an enormous space of possibilities. The organism that develops is not arbitrary. It is a highly specific, law-field embodiment of those constraints. The information in the genome is exactly this narrowing of developmental outcomes. The framework would be in trouble if we discovered an essential, operational form of information that cannot be interpreted as a constraint on possible configurations of anything like phi. For example, if there were demonstrable phenomena where information changes without any associated narrowing or widening of possible states, or if consciousness required a primitive kind of information that does not map to constraints at all, then our picture would be incomplete. That would not necessarily destroy the holophase language, but it would show that its notion of information is not universal. It would be one powerful layer among others, not the whole story. Part 8. Examples across scales. We can now connect this abstract picture to concrete examples across different domains, keeping in mind that here we are still in the abstract level, not yet committing to a specific physical realization of phi. In physics, the early universe offers a famous example. The initial state appears to have been extremely special, very smooth, very low entropy, yet containing seeds of later structure. In our language, that early state was a configuration of phi with enormous constraint. Almost all other arrangements were ruled out. As the universe evolves, constraints relax at large scales, entropy rises, and the space of accessible configurations grows. Locally, however, new constraints form in galaxies, stars, planets, and living systems. Information is not simply created from nothing. It is reshaped and redistributed as constraints shift from one scale and sector to another. In technology, a digital image is a clean illustration. Consider a blank grid of pixels. At the start, each pixel could be any color. The space of possible images is immense. A particular photograph is one path through this space, a specific assignment of values to pixels. When we store that image as a file, we are storing enough bits to reconstruct those constraints. Compression is the art of describing the same constraints using fewer bits. The more regularities and patterns in the image, the easier it is to compress, because the structure lets us explain many pixels with fewer independent choices. Here, information is literally which pixel patterns are allowed versus all that are ruled out. In human society, a legal contract, as mentioned earlier, is almost a direct embodiment of information as constraint. Before the contract, the behavior of two parties could vary widely. After signing, their options are sharply narrowed. Payment must be on these dates, at these rates, under these conditions. The contract is not a physical force pushing atoms around. It is a structured set of constraints on future actions. Yet it profoundly shapes what actually happens. In our abstract language, it is a specific pattern in a semantic space that cuts away huge portions of possibility. That is information at work in the human domain. Part 9. Learning to see information. How can you train yourself to perceive information as constraint in daily life? One simple way is to look for specificity. Whenever something could easily have been different but clearly is not, ask, what ruled out those alternatives? Listen to a spoken sentence. The space of possible sounds that could have come out of the speaker's mouth is enormous. But what you actually hear is a particular sequence of phonemes, pauses, and tones that conforms to a language's rules. Grammar and vocabulary are constraints. They eliminate most random sound sequences. The particular content of the sentence narrows things even further. All that narrowing is information. Look at a handwritten signature. Many possible squiggles could have appeared on the page, but your signature usually has a stable pattern. That pattern distinguishes your signature from others. It rules out a vast number of other shapes your hand could have drawn. The more consistent and distinctive the pattern, the more information it carries about you. Even in emotional life, you can sometimes feel information as constraint. A vague, confused feeling is like an unconstrained state. Many interpretations are possible, but none is firm. A moment of clarity, this is what I really think, or this is what I must do, is like the sudden application of strong constraints. Many inner possibilities fall away. One path stands out. That focusing is a kind of informational crystallization. Part 10. Returning to phi, the constraint tapestry. As always, we return to our single field. Phi is the one continuous cyclic movement from which everything unfolds. It is the canvas, the thread, and the loom all at once. Information in our sense does not sit beside phi or float above it. It is not a separate substance. It is the shape of phi's constraint, how tightly or loosely the actual pattern of the field sits inside its space of possibilities. A perfectly unconstrained phi, if such a thing were even meaningful, would be like total formlessness. Nothing distinct, nothing memorable, no pattern to recognize. Every real pattern of phi, by contrast, is a sculpture carved into that formlessness by constraints. The more precise the carving, the more detailed the sculpture, the more informational it is. In Episode 8, we have now climbed to the final conceptual level of the pure abstract language. We have seen phi as a field, its derivatives as alphabet, its relations as grammar, its topology as deep structure, its intensities as degrees of expression, its action as preference for elegant stories, its modes as pure building blocks, and now its information as the measure of how sharply its stories cut into possibility. The language is no longer just a way to describe anything, it is a way to count, compare, and communicate specificity. From this point forward, our task will be to take this fully developed abstract language and begin to connect it to the physical world, to show how, when interpreted, these constraints become physical information, physical energy, physical matter, and eventually physical minds. The bridge from abstract phi information to concrete physical information is the next great arc of our journey. For now, as you move through your day, try to see the world as a living play of constraints. Every pattern, every law, every stable structure, every clear message is a narrowing of what could have been into what actually is. In that narrowing, you are witnessing the informational heart of the holophase at work. Salam and peace be upon you.